Welcome to the Research Works podcast, live from the European Academy of Childhood Disability Conference 2024 in Bruges, Belgium. Join us for interviews with keynote speakers, world-renowned researchers and clinicians, and behind-the-scenes stories from one of the great paediatric conferences in the world.
All right, Dr. Jill Zwicker, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm so looking forward to speaking with you today about your paper. It's actually your oral communication titled White Matter Changes in Rehabilitation in Children Co-occurring ASD and DCD. So you're from the University of British Columbia, so you've travelled a bit of a way to get here for this conference. Yes. And you're also the Canada Research Chair in Paediatric Brain Development and Rehabilitation. All very impressive things, which is why we are looking forward to speaking with you today. So Jill, would you mind just sort of summarising this particular oral communication that you're about to give?
Sure. So this study is a result of, it began as a randomized controlled trial of children with autism without intellectual disability with co-occurring developmental coordination disorder or motor difficulties. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough sample size to do the randomized. They were randomized, but we had to combine the wait list and the treatment group together to get enough power to look at changes with intervention.
Sure.
But we had 26 children between the ages of 8 and 12. Mm-hmm. They came for an MRI scan first, and then they were randomized to either a treatment or wait list group. The treatment group went on to have 10 weeks of co-op intervention, which I'll explain in a moment.
Yes,
and the waitlist group just carried on for 10 weeks.
Okay.
And then all the students came back, or the children came back for a second MRI. And then the waitlist group then received the treatment and a third scan, and the treatment group carried on and they had a follow-up scan. So we have controlled for maturation and looked at maintenance of the skills after intervention.
Amazing. Look, even as you're describing that and the 26 participants that you did have, that's a lot of participants to put through and to do MRI scans for. So I can't wait to go into what that looked like. But yeah, let's start with the co-op approach. That would be a really great thing to be able to describe. So what does the co-op approach actually entail? So
co-op is actually, it's a cognitive-based problem-solving approach to therapy where we teach the children and families a global problem-solving framework called goal, plan, do, check. And so the goal is what the child hopes to achieve and can be broken down into small pieces. The plan is where the therapist helps guide the child to discover strategies to overcome the motor difficulty that they're having. The do is trying it out, and then the check is if it worked. And it's an iterative process that gets repeated many times while the child develops a toolbox, if you like, of problem-solving strategies to achieve their motor goals.
I love that. So the approach is very much about the child actively being a participant in their own intervention, problem solving, with the hope that they can apply this framework to many other aspects of life.
Exactly.
Yes. It really is. It's not a dependence on a therapist approach. Really is something that they can go out and, in a way, it could be really efficient use of funding or time, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yes. And the bulk of my research is actually hoping to provide the evidence base to make co-op as standard of care, because at the moment it's only available for families who have private funds to pay for therapy. And I'm hoping with the brain imaging results that government and policy officials will think then it's unethical not to treat the children. Yeah,
that's a great motivation. And so much of therapy, I guess, along the way has been out of a desire to help, has always been a little bit about therapists showing, doing, maybe intervening a little bit too much. And the idea of actually stepping back in itself is a bit of a paradigm shift and a different way of thinking.
It is.
Do you find that that's still a barrier when you're trying to teach clinicians or tell parents about this approach? Because I think people often come into therapy with their own idea what it might look like.
Yes. So there has been some, challenges with uptake of the co-op approach, but I think now it is becoming much more utilized. It was developed or published in 2001. And so here we are, 23 years later. And there's been courses around the world and therapists becoming trained in the approach. Yep. I think once the initial barrier is broken, then the therapists who are trained in it and have tried it are amazed by the results.
Yeah,
and
brilliant.
Not just for children with DCD, but with many other conditions and even adults with neurological injury and other things.
It's widely published. I do see it a lot in a lot of different populations. Is there a particular reason why children with DCD or on the autism spectrum disorder, why co-op is particularly a great approach for them? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in terms of DCD, that's for whom it was developed in the first place. And children with DCD don't learn motor skills in the way that typically developing children do. Yeah. And rather than that sort of implicit learning that happens with feedback within the body, that system doesn't work very well in children with DCD. Yeah. And so we want to use the cognitive system to then drive those changes. Right. And so that cognitive approach takes advantage of their strengths. Yes. Because they're usually of average to high IQ.
Yes.
And that problem-solving approach is basically telling the body what it needs to do rather than it understanding what to do from those feelings from the inside.
Yeah, I love that. And I suppose it's, again, it's very consistent where a lot of research is headed into is that real strengths-based approach, isn't it? Because I think when you think about it through logically, a lot of the times if we're trying to show a child how to do something, we're basing it on our own perception of what that could look like or the process we might need to follow for that child to then follow. So really projecting that back onto the child is such a beautiful approach. Yes. Thank you for explaining co-op. I think it's always worth fleshing that out because it's so relevant for many populations. Okay, so now to go into the all-important sort of results. Can you summarize those results for me? The fact that you did MRI, wow, amazing.
Yes. So we looked at two different types of imaging in this case. So one was diffusion tensor imaging, which is an advanced technique to look at white matter pathways in the brain. Yep. And that's what I'll talk about in a moment. But we also looked at what's called functional connectivity. So the wiring of the brain at rest and how those areas are connected. So what we found after co-op, so amazingly after only 10 weeks of therapy, so once a week for 10 weeks, we found changes in two particular regions of the cerebellum, which we've long thought has been implicated in DCD, but also in autism spectrum disorder, as well as other neurodevelopmental conditions. But so the two areas, one is the vermis area 6, and this particular area links to the motor areas of the frontal lobe. Wow. And so this area is involved in balance, eye-hand coordination, eye movements, and bimanual coordination. Wow. So that makes sense with what we were working on. Yeah. But it's also involved in cognitive and executive functions, which also makes sense given the nature of the co-op approach. And these changes were quite a large effect from pre to post intervention.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And then the other area of the brain was the right cerebellar peduncle, which carries the pathways to the cerebellum. And so the primary motor cortex, information from the primary motor cortex goes to the cerebellum through this peduncle. Yeah. And this is, involved in the motor output of the cortex and is also involved in cognitive and executive function.
Wow.
And so this means that there has been structural changes in the brain after these 10 weeks of intervention.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I think what's even more exciting almost is that after those 10 weeks, those changes were maintained even after therapy. So they're long-lasting changes.
Yes. And that's the best part of it, right? That's the one that you really want to see the change sustain. That would have been incredible to see those results come to life. And, in terms of was it diffuse tensor, the DTI.
DTI, yes.
Yep. So that's the one where you can see a lot of the colours. There's the blue and the green, depends on the direction, and that's how you can see the pathways.
Yes, exactly.
Wow,
Very
that's
good.
really, really incredible. I know, I've seen a few of them before, and I thought, oh, that would be an incredible thing to be able to study. So the fact that you were able to show that is so significant. So from here, where to for you now? Like, to have these kind of results with such an effect size, where do you hope this will go? Is this sufficient evidence at the moment? Do we need to do more? Like, where is it?
Right. Well, I have had in Canada, anyways, in the British Columbia, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Child and Family Development are all involved in various services for children with DCD, or actually the lack of services. And so I have been able to get to the table at each of those ministries.
Amazing.
So now we're trying to get some action to hopefully start to advocate for change.
Yeah.
This is in combination with other work that we've done with interviews of parents across the country and the impact of DCD, not only on their child, but the family. And so we have quantitative data from families. We have very poignant quotes from families.
Beautiful.
Brain imaging evidence. And so I'm hoping that, you know, the culmination of this work will result in some change.
Yeah. Can I ask quickly about, I didn't touch on it earlier because we're also obsessed with the white matter changes, but in terms of the motor outcomes, were you able to measure that functionally? Was that part of the study?
Yes, it was. So we used 3 different measures. So one was the cognitive orientation to, the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, the COPM, which is the child rating their performance and satisfaction on each of their goals.
Yes.
The Performance Quality Rating Scale, which is a video recording of the child doing the goals.
Yep.
And a therapist blinded to intervention and pre-test to post-test viewed the child and scored the quality of their movement.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And then we also had a standardized measure of motor function.
Wow. Okay.
And so there were statistically significant, but also clinically meaningful improvements in performance and satisfaction from the child's perspective.
Brilliant.
And very similar results with the therapist's observations.
Yeah.
So we have objective and subjective input.
Yeah.
And again, those were maintained at follow-up. And then we did have a slight increase in motor function or motor skills based on a standardized measure. But those were not maintained. And we didn't actually expect to find those results because we were training specific goals, not underlying motor difficulties.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was interesting that we did see a change, very small. But
I guess that speaks to the specificity as well, doesn't it?
Yes.
A measure would be quite broad on gross motor skills, but if you're very focused on something the child's identified, it's only going to be that area that might see improvement.
Yeah. So basically, based on neuroplasticity, that's what we would expect. Like what you train is what you gain.
Yeah. It's very consistent, really, isn't it? Which is brilliant, and it's really reassuring for clinicians as they're doing these evidence-based approaches that are really about self-initiated, active, meaningful, something that they enjoy. If it's a goal that they've set, it's powerful stuff. It sounds simple when we describe it, but it's really powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And so I'm hoping with our work from our lab and those of many others around the world that are working on this as well, that we can make a change.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah. What would your final piece of advice be for clinicians? There'll be clinicians that'll be listening to this, and what will be your take home for them that you'd really encourage them to really look at in their practice?
I would say if you haven't had the opportunity to be co-op trained, I would certainly encourage that.
Yes.
And there are many avenues to do that now. That's the one positive thing from the pandemic, is that many of the training sessions have been put online. So you don't necessarily have to travel far and wide to take the course. But it's also offered in many countries, and a combination of in-person, hybrid, and then completely online. And I think no matter what area of practice you're in, if you're working with children or working with adults with neurological injury or other conditions, this approach has been very, very effective. And I think you'll find a difference in your own satisfaction, because the changes you can make without even putting your hands on the child or the person.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. And look, the dosage was once a week of this approach, and sometimes people sometimes people engage in hours upon hours. So it kind of really just makes you stop and think a little bit about what it is that you're doing.
Right.
And I love that. It's a great study. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I absolutely love that conversation. And all the best for the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, to all our listeners, hope you really enjoyed that. We'll talk to you all again really soon. Bye.